Hi, welcome back to Anti-Social Studies. I'm Emily Glankler, and today I'm going to give you a brief history of Black nonviolent protest. Essentially, before I get into it, my main argument today is that white Americans have been testing the patience of Black people for 400 years, and they have proven to be amazingly patient in their willingness to politely and peacefully ask for the right to live and to be equal. And what I'm seeing right now is a very reasonable beginning of an end to that patience. Uh, so, we've all heard of nonviolent protest, right? We think that Gandhi invented it, but it's been used in modern history to protest colonialism all around the world. We've seen it with the Cherokee Nation, with the Maori of New Zealand, to the women's suffrage movement, Korea's March 1st movement. Dr. King and the American Civil Rights Movement that we're most familiar with were most inspired by Gandhi's use of nonviolent resistance to oppose British imperialism in India. And in a lot of ways, African Americans have been resisting kind of American white imperialism over people of color and their bodies. So, to a lot of the people in the streets right now that are protesting police brutality, a lot of people are asking, well, why do they have to destroy property or loot buildings? Or why can't they just protest more peacefully? So to the first question, I'll tell you for one that we're finding that a lot of those that are destroying property are not part of the movement at all. They're anarchists, or they're people that are intentionally trying to discredit the movement by painting them as violent. And so you even asking that question means it's working. But on another note, later in this episode, I'm going to explain to you why I actually don't think the destruction of property is violent at all. I actually think it is a very effective form of nonviolent resistance. To the second question, to those wondering if Dr. King would approve of the methods being used today, we'll never know, but I do want to give you a brief history of Black protest in this country so that maybe you can understand why many civil rights activists today are getting a little impatient. All right, our country had around 250 years of slavery. During those 2.5 centuries, countless enslaved Africans protested for their freedom, but very few were successful and even fewer are known to us now. But in many ways, the first form of peaceful protest was the application of Christianity to their experience in slavery. While slave owners were using the Bible to justify their oppression, African Americans saw themselves as the modern-day Jews, enslaved and removed from their homeland, but still strong and waiting for a judgment day that would prove that they understood the teachings of Jesus way better than their white owners did. From enslavement on, the Black church has been the center of Black protest because it was often the only institution where they had autonomy and could choose their own Black leadership. It's no coincidence that so many of the leaders of the civil rights movement were pastors. Furthermore, the act of escaping or attempting to escape slavery was a form of peaceful resistance. In fact, since enslaved people were viewed legally as property, anyone helping an enslaved person free themselves would have been accused of stealing or destroying a white man's property. And here's where I'm going to remind you that really the only civilization that cares very deeply about personal property is white Western civilization. Because for the rest of the world, the property of white people often came at the expense of non-white land, labor, and lives. During the Reconstruction Era, after the abolition of slavery, as soon as Black men were allowed to participate in the legal political process, they did. They wanted to be within the legitimate system. More than 600 Black men were elected to state legislatures and 16 men served in the House of Representatives. 2 Black men became senators. Side note on this one, in all of American history, we've had around 2,000 people who have served in the Senate. Do you know how many of them have been Black? Out of 2,000 people, over 230 years, we have had a total of 10 Black senators. 2 of them are in the Senate today. So when Reconstruction ended and Jim Crow began, it was nearly impossible for Black people to serve in high offices across the South, and really the North, if we're being honest. So African Americans began debating the best plan of attack, how to get the rights that were owed to them by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Some, like Booker T. Washington, wanted to focus on economic independence. Basically, Black people should get technical training, work on their farms, save their money, and after a few generations, they would have the economic power to be listened to by white society. Others, like W.E.B. Du Bois, demanded full equality now and wanted to focus on getting a talented 10th into the best universities and in positions of social and political power to demand their rights. In the end, they both were right and they both worked, right? What I talk about in my classroom is that when you look at something like the Montgomery bus boycott after Rosa Parks refused to move. That boycott wouldn't have worked without both Washington and Du Bois's philosophies, right? Without Washington's philosophy, you wouldn't have had a large population of Black people whose money mattered, right? So the fact that they didn't ride the bus hurt the city's budget. But without leadership like MLK, who was kind of a descendant of Du Bois's Talented Tenth, the movement might not have been as organized or able to kind of voice the movement to the broader nation. So World War II really opened up a ton of possibilities for discussions about civil rights. Like, as the US went around the world celebrating its triumph over racist dictatorships like Nazi Germany and Japan, people of color back home saw an opportunity to point out some hypocrisy. Leaders like A. Philip Randolph organized the Double V movement. Basically, Black people needed to fight for two victories: victory at home and victory abroad. African Americans served with distinction in both the world wars, and like many colonized people around the world who had fought for their imperial colonizers, they came home and began demanding their own equality. Randolph and Bayard Rustin organized a March on Washington. This is decades before the I Have a Dream March on Washington, that pressured FDR to pass an executive order prohibiting racial discrimination in all defense industries. So peaceful protest worked. They actually didn't even have to have the march. Meanwhile, Du Bois's Talented Tenth had been building up a cadre of lawyers and activists through the NAACP that was now gaining traction in the justice system. So African Americans were peacefully marching and organizing to pressure the system from the outside, and they were working through the legal system from within. They were doing it all right. A major triumph came in 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education, declaring racial segregation in schools unconstitutional. And then, nothing. Schools around the country found loopholes or straight up refused to desegregate. Only one teacher in an entire elementary school agreed to teach 6-year-old Ruby Bridges because she was Black. And the National Guard had to escort the Little Rock Nine to high school. Employers still discriminated on the basis of race, and Black people were still being killed. They had done everything right, at least the way white people had wanted them to protest, legally, peacefully, non-violently, and they mostly just had symbolic victories. So this is the moment that we begin to see a well-organized branch of the movement that begins to question the validity of nonviolence. As Dr. King is asking African Americans to love their enemy and continue to peacefully disobey unjust laws, other Black people are growing impatient. We often think of the civil rights movement as beginning with Dr. King, but in many ways the movement began in 1619. Or legally speaking, it definitely began in 1868 with the ratification of the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal protection of the laws to all citizens. So they'd been protesting and pushing for their equality for decades, if not centuries. But Dr. King was just one in a long line of Black leaders who had been playing by the rules, right? Washington and Du Bois were both respectable, notice air quotes, Black men who had in many ways assimilated to white society. Du Bois was the first Black person to earn a PhD from Harvard. You don't get much whiter than that, right? The NAACP was working within a corrupt justice system trying to fix it from the inside out. Hell, Rosa Parks was selected as a prime candidate to challenge segregation laws in Montgomery because she was an older, light-skinned woman who worked for the NAACP and was active in her church. She was basically the least threatening Black person they could find. The vast majority of the movement had been demanding justice and equality in a way that was the most acceptable and non-threatening to white people, and still nothing was really changing. People like Malcolm X saw this and had other ideas. Now, to be clear, Malcolm X did not advocate violence for the sake of violence, but he did argue that the civil rights movement needed other tools at their disposal, and one of them might be violence. His famous speech, "The Ballot or the Bullet," gives white society an ultimatum. You can give us our rights, the ballot, or else. It's up to you. Ball's in your court, white people. And I really believe that one of the reasons that Dr. King was able to get so much accomplished in the mid-60s was partly because Congress and the larger white community realized that they were having to choose between Dr. King or Malcolm X, right? So only with this character foil did white people decide that King was maybe the lesser of two evils. And in many ways, at the same time, this is similar to what's happening across the Atlantic Ocean in South Africa. Another person who's held up as this lofty figure in the nonviolent movement is Nelson Mandela. But Nelson Mandela's ANC was having a similar debate over methods to dismantle apartheid. And one of their main tactics, sanctioned by Mandela himself, was the destruction of property. The ANC bombed railroads and other infrastructure, they blew up government offices that regulated the movement of Black South Africans, and they attacked police stations. The question I've really genuinely been thinking about the last few days is whether or not destruction of property is in itself violent. Mandela didn't seem to think so. In fact, considering Black people then and today are protesting the destruction of their own bodies, breaking windows and jumping on cop cars seems pretty timid in return. Dr. King also seemed to agree. During the long, hot summer of 1967, there were, dozens of race riots around the country, and King said, quote, "I am aware that there are many who wince at a distinction between property and persons, who hold both sacrosanct. My views are not so rigid. A life is sacred. Property is intended to serve life, and no matter how much we surround it with rights and respect, it has no personal being. It is part of the earth man walks on. It is not a man." So again, he's making that distinction. If people out there are outraged about a target being destroyed, the same or more than they're outraged about a man being murdered, there's something wrong with that. Dr. King goes on, and I think this is a really good point. Quote, "If hostility to whites were ever going to dominate a Negro's attitude and reach murderous proportions, surely it would be during a riot. But far more rioters took chances with their own lives in their attacks on property than threatened the life of anyone else. Why were they so violent with property then? Because property represents the white power structure, which they were attacking and trying to destroy." Basically, King's arguing, if there was ever a time when Black people were going to rise up and murder a bunch of white people and be totally violent, it would be during these riots. And yet, even during these riots in 1967 or 2020, they're not. They're going out on the streets, and the most violent they're getting is breaking windows or destroying property. That's kind of amazingly impressive when you think about what they're protesting. So whatever your views on destruction of property are, we can all agree that most white people today seem to think that Dr. King should be the guiding light of Black activists, right? I mean, let's ignore the fact that in most polls, white people in the 1960s highly disapproved of Dr. King and even his nonviolent methods. They thought even his marches and protests were like a little too much, right? But Dr. King did everything the right way, if there is a right way. He was educated. He was a Christian. He advocated for peace and brotherhood between Black and white people. He urged his followers not to resort to violence, even while standing on the porch of his home minutes after it had been bombed. And yet, they still killed him. Since 1968, the civil rights movement has splintered, right? For decades, various groups focused on different aspects of the institutions that were still keeping Black people from experiencing true equality. Some worked on affirmative action, some on housing reform, criminal justice reform, an end to poverty, etc. But it would seem that the various branches are meeting back up again in the Black Lives movement, Black Lives Matter movement. And lynchings are still occurring. George Floyd was lynched. But now it was caught on a camera for the world to see. And after 400 years, Black people are still overwhelmingly protesting peacefully for their right to live. What could be more nonviolent than kneeling during a song at a sports game? And yet Kaepernick was ridiculed and punished. Basketball players wear shirts saying, "I can't breathe," and they're criticized. People simply say that Black lives matter, and they're painted as racist or radical or anti-white. After all of this, when Black people take to the streets in response to a man being lynched, they hold signs, or sing, or march, or yes, sometimes they destroy property. I mean, I think they've been more than patient. And it's now on white people to decide just how much longer we're willing to keep Black people down before we risk a full-out revolution. Thanks.